The 12th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Saturday at 6 p.m.
Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
Troubling to watch, it's unfortunately a common occurrence among kids of all ages in this country, including those living right here in Nebraska. Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, bullying. Joining us to talk more about it are Father Tom Simons, an assistant professor of education at Creighton University, Rhonda Turner, a postdoctorate fellow at the Monroe Meyer Institute, and Gerald Relford, a safe, secure, disciplined schools facilitator with Omaha Public Schools. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Father, I think we're going to start with you.
Okay.
Define bullying.
I would define bullying as one person doing something to another person to make them afraid. Usually there's a power difference. The person who's the bully seems to have more power than the other person for lots of different reasons. And usually they're trying to get something. They're trying to get some money, they're trying to get some social prestige, they're trying to get something out of that bullying relationship. And there can be lots of different kinds of bullying. Physical, verbal, sexual, and now we have electronic bullying as well.
And how prevalent is this problem?
I think most of the statistics that the federal government collects put it at about 25 to 30% of all students, elementary and secondary schools, are being bullied.
Okay. And Dr. Turner, we have a graphic that really does walk us through those behaviors that someone who might be identified as a bully, exhibits. If you could walk us through those.
Right, there are a number of risk factors or things that you can look at as kind of a sign that this child might be involved in bullying behaviors. And I think typically we think of bullies as the socially inept kind of kid that doesn't know how to make friends, so then they act aggressively, and that's sort of the stereotype or the way that adults think of bullies. But really, when we look more at the research, what we know about bullies is that they tend to be kids who are really confident, who have a really strong, healthy sense of self-esteem, who have a pro-violence or pro-bullying attitude. In fact, that's the #1 risk factor for this kind of behavior. Also, we tend to see kids who you might think of as hot-tempered or having a quick fuse as being involved in bullying. Sometimes it's kids who are impulsive, but then it's important to remember that there's also the flip side bully who, rather than being impulsive, is a real careful planner and is able to pick targets and situations where they're least likely to get caught and get themselves into trouble. And then students who have a real low tolerance for frustrations tend to be more involved in bullying behaviors than other students.
Okay, and before we get too much further into the interview then, let's walk us through. We have another graphic that really does talk to those children who are the ones on the receiving end. So if you could walk us through that as well.
Right. Students who are most likely to be bullied, although bullying is something that can happen to any kid, and sometimes it's kind of a matter of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the children who have the most risk for being victims of bullying tend to be those children who are more anxious, who may be less secure, who approach situations cautiously, who have a lower sense of self-esteem, who have more difficulty standing up for themselves, who would tend not to retaliate, because bullies want to pick targets whom they have a real shot at success of being able to victimize without getting victimized back in return. So kids who tend to be more socially isolated, who don't have a lot of social support, and then also kids who have less social skills are more likely to be victims of bullying.
Okay.
One of the things that our research here in Nebraska shows us is that all of those factors are true, but the key risk factor for being a victim of bullying tends to be anything that makes you stand out from the crowd. So being overweight or being underweight, being involved in special education or being in a gifted program. It's any factor that sort of makes that kid stand out from the norm or the rest of the kids in that school tends to put kind of a little target on their back at the same time.
Okay, and Gerald, you've been listening to all of this. You work with Omaha Public Schools, so you're around kids on a routine basis. From what has been said, what would you have to add to that?
Well, and I just think two things. One, often when anti-bullying strategies are put into place, no matter if it's a school or workplace or what have you, there is a focus on reacting to the bullying, and I think that's not as good as if we all can say, what can we do before bullying happens to prevent bullying acts? Fortunately for us in the Omaha Public Schools and for families and staff, we have what is called the Safe, Secure, Disciplined Schools process. One of the 5 district aims is that we have a safe and secure learning environment. And so through something that we call the 4 universal skills and other parts of this SSDS process, if you will, we have something called the 4 universal skills that says, let's make sure we've done what we can with the students to focus on building positive relationships initially, to prevent and alleviate as much before it happens as possible. Let's also make sure that we have something that we call high staff visibility and supervision, that the adults in the school building are strategically placed every day, whenever and wherever there are kids, just being visible so that everyone can see that we are there, that we're also supervising and responding to the inappropriate behavior as well as the appropriate behavior that we see. And there is another skill that we call frequent feedback. So now that we have seen a bully, or we've seen a victim, or we've seen a bystander, we can provide some feedback to them in terms of what's appropriate or what is inappropriate. And so those are some pieces that we see as very, very key, focusing on prevention.
Yes, and very reassuring to those of us listening to know that the schools are taking a proactive approach. Unfortunately, as with so much else, though, this is going to happen regardless. And I applaud OPS and the other systems, Monroe-Meyer and those places that are taking that type of approach to this. But I want to back up a little bit and talk more about those specifics regarding the bullying itself, and then we'll get back into more of the preventative measures involved. Father Simons, if you could talk to us a little bit, Dr. Turner was saying that oftentimes it's the kids who stand out, which is kind of opposite. We're all to be taught to really play into our strengths and do the best that we can. I've also heard that bullying differs between boys and girls. Talk to us about what those differences might be that you've seen.
Well, I think sometimes with girls you're going to see them using social isolation. They're putting somebody off by themselves. They're not calling them. They're not inviting them to parties. They're kind of leaving them out there on their own. They might use the rumor mill, say things about people behind their backs. Boys might tend to use more physical aggression, more physical behaviors. But I've seen girls use physical intimidation, and I've seen boys use the rumor mill. And so I think really, while sometimes you read books and it does seem like girls tend to use one thing more than boys or whatever, I would look at it more as look at the individual, not the boy or the girl, but the individual. Because you might have a young woman that's fairly good size, that's bigger than her peers, and she's able to use physical intimidation as a bullying technique. So I think it's more looking at the individuals rather than at whether they're male or female, and the techniques they might use based on kind of what they've got, the skill set that they have. It's kind of an odd way to look at it, but bullying is one of those things where if you're going to do it, you're going to use the skills and the things that you have. So if you're big, or if you are good at rumors or whatever, you're going to use what you have to accomplish what you want to do. So,
what about the grade levels? What do we see in the difference there? Because this starts at a very early age and goes all the way up, oftentimes into and takes on different, whatever forms in adulthood. But
Right.
what are we seeing just from the K through 12 as being some of the major differences there?
Right. Well, Dr. Turner or Gerald may want to add to this, but from what I've seen, I would put the highest number of bullying acts happening something like 4th grade to 8th grade. It seems to really be a middle school thing, maybe a little earlier than that. People get in 9th grade, they might still be being bullied, but as they get into 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, the actual acts of bullying decrease. But what happens is because they've been bullied and they don't have friends and they've maybe got a low self-esteem and they feel like they haven't been involved in school, then they might tend to be on the outside and not have a group, not have friends, and they feel like they're kind of the loner type of person. That can happen with somebody that's been bullied. And also, sometimes when people get a little older, they do find a way to connect and get into a peer group and get involved. And I think you've seen that in some of the things that have happened, some of the high-profile school violence issues, like Columbine, which is one that everybody's kind of familiar with. it seems like both of those students had been bullied early on, but when they got into high school, they were kind of excluded from a couple high-profile groups, and they felt like they were on the outside. So that can kind of happen. And another thing I found is that when students get older, they don't want to talk about what happened when they were being bullied when they were younger. They don't want to go back and think about those old hurts, because it brings it all up, and it can almost be like kind of it happens again when they go back and they think about what happened to them. So oftentimes they don't want to talk about it. I tried to do a study of people that were bullied, and a lot of the students said, I don't want to talk about it. So I wasn't really able to get that much information.
So what then, Dr. Turner, happens if you do have an individual who has been or fallen victim to this? You know, we're all taught that the more you talk about it, the better you are to feel about, who you are and what's going on. So, what is your advice, or what is your feedback on that?
I think the most important thing is to provide immediate help to children at the time that they're being victimized, when those issues are fresh, and to provide them with the support that they need then, because having them come back and revisit it later can be difficult for a number of reasons. In some aspects it may feel a little bit like going back to a period that was really negative for them, and so not wanting to do that. But I think what we need to do is be very proactive and observe it in the schools. And one of the things that we do at Target Bullying, which is a research group up at UNL, is try to provide schools with tools that they can use to determine what is going on in their schools right now in terms of bullying and victimization, so we can implement some interventions for those students who are being bullied at that moment, rather than trying to go back and provide services for them maybe at a later point. So I think really making as immediate a response as possible is really key.
And when Dr. Turner's talking about what's going on right now, Gerald, is there a typical scenario of bullying in the schools right now? What are you hearing, most often that's happening that is drawing attention to the officials?
Yeah, and I don't know that there's a typical scenario, but what we are hearing a lot more at this every day, and it's been alluded to already, and that is cyberbullying or electronic bullying. And that seems to be one of the worst types, because the individuals can stay the bullies can stay in the background, and often the victims don't even know where it's coming from or from whom it's coming. And so that's been a real problem. That's what we're hearing more and more, especially at the secondary levels of schools.
Okay, and how is it that you're addressing, because I really do want to talk more about this cyberbullying. How is it that you address that issue then when a student or someone comes to you to talk to you about this? How do you address, you're saying that half the time we don't even know who's on the other side. How do you address a problem like that?
Yeah, and it is a tough issue. The main thing that we advocate, that staff members do and parents do, is to take it all seriously. First of all, I want to back up and say that we in the Omaha Public Schools, we want teachers and counselors and administrators to teach about the bullying process, to talk about what the bully typically does and why they do it, to talk about victims and what happens there, to talk about the fact that there is a third role, that of the bystander. And there is a fourth role that I think some people are not as acutely aware of, and that is what we call the intervener. And that is the bystander that all of a sudden now can do something when they're witnessing a bullying act, whether it's to say stop or what have you. But if they can take that step, then I read a research statistic recently that says if we can teach students to intervene, to become that intervener, within 10 seconds every time that they do that, the bullying by the bully does sort of stop. And so those are very, very powerful things. And again, I think we have to, in the schools, we have to really focus on teaching about the bullying process and what can be done.
Well, that's going to take a pretty special kid to step up to the plate and intervene in a society where nobody, quote, wants to get involved with anything. And there might be repercussions for that student in getting involved too. Right. So I guess curiously for me, walk us through a counseling session with some of these students who are already fearful for one reason or another. They don't want to fall victim to it themselves, so they stay out of the picture. Walk us through how you would actually counsel kids to be proactive and want to get involved rather than do the opposite, which is what I think many people do tend to do.
And I think in terms of counseling the victim, if I can use that term, I think we as adults have to first go to the victim and say, you know what, do you feel comfortable talking about this? Do you want the chance to, if we can arrange it, meet with the person who has been bullying you or harassing you and have a chance to talk with them and to say how you feel and this sort of thing. They ought to have that right to say no or yes or what have you, instead of just to force the issue. Then I think the counseling continues with the bully and with the parents of the bully to say, here's what's been going on, here's what the victim has told us, here's what we do not allow in our school systems, here's what we do expect out of you in terms of appropriate behavior. And so, and it really does depend on the individual situation and case in terms of how you counsel, what you will say, what road you'll take to sort of solve the issue.
Okay, but for those kids who are actually witnessing this, they're privy to all of this, that's really something I want to address, because those are the ones that can help make a difference and get the ball rolling in the right direction. So I am a student, I'm part of that school, and you are trying to convince me that stepping in is the right thing to do. What is it that you're going to tell me?
Exactly, and stepping in could be a whole list of things, anywhere from saying stop, verbalizing to the bully, stop, or to go over and to grab the victim, if you will, and to try to remove them from the situation, to telling another adult, to making sure that you're in with another person or staying in groups as opposed to being alone. I mean, it just really, there's a gamut of things that we can tell kids, especially those that see bullying, what it is that they can do to sort of help out.
Are they doing it?
Hopefully so. You know, I think more and more. I think the more that we have educated kids about the bullying process, yes, I think kids are starting to intervene more and more, absolutely.
One of the things that we know from research is that the vast majority of bullying incidents happen within a group setting. So there are other kids present at the time that these episodes happen. And another thing that we know from the research is that about a third of those kids who are witnessing share the approbation of the violence with the bully. So they're on his side or her side, they're on the bully's side. But there's about another third of the students who say, I wanted to do something about it, but I just didn't know what to do. So intervention efforts that occur maybe on a classroom-wide basis or a school-wide basis can really target that group of kids who wants to intervene but doesn't know how, and provide them with what are some strategies that you can use. And another thing that those classroom-wide or school-wide interventions can target is those pro-bullying attitudes, because we know that's one of the highest risk factors for bullies to be involved in bullying behaviors. But we also know that that's part of that support group that sort of maintains bullying behaviors or makes it positive for the bully. It makes it work for them. And so reducing the number of kids that share those pro-bullying attitudes then just takes away some of that base of support for the bully and his or her behaviors at that time.
Well, and speaking of which, and something that I did want to address, and Father Simons will talk to you about this, tell us about that group of individuals with whom the bully hangs out. I mean, you know, I can't think of too many kids who would want to be around something that negative with, you know, that kind of repercussion. Who are these kids that are hanging with the individuals that are hurting other people?
I think about the Harry Potter movies, and you've got, what's the guy who's the head of the Slytherin house, the young guy? He's got a couple of friends that hang with him, and he's not a very nice guy. He's always doing bad things to Harry. He's always trying to mess Harry up, and he's got those couple guys that are kind of with him and always doing everything he says. And I think it's kind of like that. You know, you'll see a couple young men that want to fit in, and this guy who's the bully guy, and they're kind of his friends, and they do his bidding. Or you see a young woman that wants to get at somebody, and so she has these friends, and she has her friends go out and do these things, write these things on the bathroom wall, or send these notes, or even go up and hit this person, but so that the actual bully, so to speak, isn't actually doing the work, but her kind of minions are going out and doing it. So I think there's some of that. They kind of form a group, and they kind of help each other out, and they want to fit in, and the bully seems to be the one who's kind of on the end, so they want to join them and some things like that. But I just wanted to, you know, comment on some things that other people on the panel have said. The more we can give students the skills to take ownership and try and prevent bullying and teach them, like Gerald was saying, specific things to do when they see bullying going on, the more that we can teach them those skills and bring it up and talk about it in class so that it's open, it's out there on the table, and we can talk about things like empathy and, for example, ask a student, what does it feel like when somebody does this to you, you know? I think that can be a really powerful tool to try and prevent bullying, as Dr. Turner and Gerald were saying.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And Dr. Turner, I did want to ask, when you look at both these populations, you know, the bullier and the child who's been bullied. And I know there's no typical answer to this, but curiously, what do they grow up to become?
Well, that's a good question. And one thing that we have to be a little bit cautious about is to think of it as two separate groups, that there's this group of bullies and that there's this group of victims and that there's no intermingling. And actually that's not entirely true, and there's a pretty significant subset of kids in the schools who identify themselves as both, that they have been victimized at different times over the course of their school years, and then in turn they've also been victimizers and participated on the other end of the spectrum. And actually it's those kids, we call them bully victims, who have been involved in both ways, that tend to have the greatest kind of psychosocial difficulties both in school and after school. But to get more directly to your question, that bullying behaviors in school tends to be more associated with sort of subsequent antisocial acts. So kids who were bullies in school have about a third times greater not opportunity, but likelihood of having been arrested or convicted as adults. They tend to be more likely to drop out. They have higher rates of absenteeism. They have more negative views towards school and education as a whole, and then that impacts the whole sort of series of lifespan choices that happen after that. Victims, that doesn't necessarily hold true, but victimization certainly also is highly associated with school absenteeism, with having a negative perception of school, and so can also lead to pretty negative outcomes for kids, and long-term psychosocial outcomes including depression, low self-esteem, higher rates of anxiety disorders and difficulties like that.
Interesting. I think before we get on to what families and friends and society in general can do to really help prevent this from happening, I do want to go back to the whole issue of cyberbullying, just to try to get a handle or a grasp on how this really happens and repeatedly. I mean, walk us through, Dr. Turner, what, you know, somebody logs on and tell us a typical scenario for that.
Well, there have been a number of studies, and typically research indicates that about a third of children are victimized in some way during the course of their school careers, and that seems to be holding true with the cyberbullying too, that about a third of students report having experienced cyberbullying at least on more than one occasion. So it's prevalent. It'll probably become increasingly prevalent as now, you know, my third grader is already asking, can he have a cell phone? And so, you know, more opportunity happens as more people have access to the technology. And so there are it can happen in a number of ways. It can be text messaging that happens right during class. It can be instant messaging. It can be Facebook or other social networking sites. It can be a tool that's used by the cyberbully, blogging, just pretty much, you know, the bullies will grow with the technology. So whatever new technology comes along, the bullies will figure out a way to employ it to their sort of evil ends, if you will say that.
So the same kids who are doing, you know, physical harm or verbal harm to another child are now logging on to do those same types of things.
Right.
And some people might say, well, gosh, you know, that's just as easy as shutting off your phone or shutting off your computer. And it's just not that simple, is it? I mean,
well, and the devastating thing about cyberbullying is that, at least with the traditional old school kinds of bullying, when the kid left school, it was over for the rest of the day. But now it follows them home. And so there's really no escape from that. And it's so anonymous that it seems that the nature of the victimization is maybe even more extreme than it would be when you have to do it more face to face.
You know, I've been reading some things about that, and it's like it comes right into your home because you get that text message no matter where you are, with your family or at home or on the way to school. And like Dr. Turner's saying, you know, even though you're not at school, you can still get that text message, that email message. You can still see something on your Facebook. So it's actually worse, I think, because it's hard for them to get away from it. And you can not turn on your computer, but eventually you're going to check your text messages. You're going to go on your Facebook account, and this bad comment, this whatever, is going to be there, you know. And that's what's so terrible about cyberbullying.
And it can spread so rapidly. The old-fashioned way of spreading a rumor, I'd have to tell you, and then you'd have to tell someone else, and then you'd have to tell. But now I could do group send, and I just got the whole student body with, you know, whatever that rumor was.
and the psychological impacts. And Gerald, I appreciate where you were coming from earlier with the whole prevention thing. I am a parent, and I am at home watching this program, and I want so much. I've suspected that these things are going on. What can we as parents do to help prevent this, and if we know what's going on, to help put a stop to it?
And I think the first thing that we can do in terms of if it's our child who has been a victim of the bullying and harassment is to listen to them, to really listen to what they have to say. We shouldn't poo-poo what they're telling us about what's going on. We should listen. Secondly, be an advocate for our children, to let them know that yes, we are listening and I'm going to do something about this, whether it involves going to school or making a phone call, what have you. Which leads to the third thing that I think is extremely important, and that is to stay in touch with the school. You know, the school is responsible for our kids during those hours that they're there. And so if someone is being bullied, then we will expect and have the schools make sure that they are doing something about that. They're also being an advocate for the students that are there.
So the thing we're hearing over and over during this interview is do something. If you see
Absolutely.
it, do something about it to make a change, because chances are good that victim isn't going to be able to step up to the plate very readily, and the bullier obviously isn't going to want to stop doing what they're doing either. Dr. Turner, anything to add to Gerald's comments?
I think also making sure to document. So when your child tells you of an incident, it's more powerful if you go to the school and you have a record. So this happened this day, this happened this day. And especially in the case of cyberbullying, it's important to be able to say, I saved this, I printed out the copies, here's what we've got. Because the school personnel, bullying doesn't happen in front of their faces. The bullies are savvy enough not to try that. So without that documentation and that sort of record keeping, it's really hard to be able to present them with something that they can then act on. So trying to document that stuff is really helpful.
Excellent. And Father Simons, in the short amount of time we have left, if there is anyone out there watching who is right now falling victim to bullying, what would you tell that student, that individual, and their family?
I think it's important for them to tell an adult, and then, like Gerald and Dr. Turner was saying, for that adult to listen, to believe it's credible, to not say, well, kids have to deal with that, because really listen to that person and find out exactly what's happening, because it could be pretty bad, and to find some ways to take some steps to address it, whether you go to the school, whether you talk to the student about giving them some strategies to avoid it. The point is, tell an adult, and the adult has to do something, because there's a lot of studies out there that show that kids stop telling adults because the adults don't do anything.
And we do have resources available. We do have a graphic that has some website information for folks in addition to what you've just said. safeyouth.org, lifeskillstraining.com, stopbullyingnow.com, and targetbullying.com. Finally, Parents United Against Bullying at mwpuab.com. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. We appreciate it. And to those of you watching, we will see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at untv.unomaha.edu. If you'd like to share your comments about this show, call UNO TV at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours.
The 12th season of Consider This is brought to you in part by From the Top, a national program showcasing the musical talents of young people. From the Top can be heard on KVNO Classical 90.7 each Saturday at 6 p.m.